Finally, it is time to reveal the perfect focal length for portrait photography. I know, I can't believe it, but the day is here. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring you a brand new made myself laugh before I even got to the fresh photography tutorial. This week, no different, and we are going to talk about the perfect focal length for portrait photography. Now, of course, I get it. I can hear you right now. There is no perfect focal length for portrait photography. That is a crazy idea, but it is certainly a lot more varied than it might seem at first when you really start getting into portraiture. A lot of us start with something like a 50mm, and there's good reason for that. We'll touch on that in a minute. Maybe we go to 85mm, maybe you go to 35mm, but you can use a wide spectrum of focal lengths to capture different kinds of portraits, and it is a massive factor in the final image. It is a massive factor in how that image is going to come across and the creative decision making behind it. So how do we make that decision? What do we do to kind of work out what focal length is going to work best for our portrait? Of course, different kinds of portraits need different kind of focal lengths. So let's talk about it. Now, I mentioned 50mm. That's generally the first kind of portrait lens that a lot of us will start with, a nifty 50, right? A 50mm f1.8. It's nice and cheap, nice and accessible, and it gives you a taste of a lens like that. 50mm is also a very natural perspective, so it's very versatile in the kinds of shots you can take. You can kind of manipulate it by actually moving yourself to actually either focus in much more on the subject, get a very blurred background, get a very nice separation between subject and background, or you can pull back, maybe even stop down a little bit and get more of the environment to tell more of a story and give more context to the portrait. So there's a lot that you can do with a 50mm lens, which is great because since so many of us start with a lens like that, it's a great one to practice and learn portrait photography with. Now, in previous videos, in previous years, we've talked about how there's a difference between using a tighter focal length, something like 85mm, which I'll be honest, is probably my favorite focal length for portraits. Using something like that makes the photo a little bit more about who the subject is. It's a flattering focal length. It's able to show off a subject's features much more. So let's say makeup or anything that you want to kind of showcase. It's a much more intimate focal length. We're getting in close with the subject. Whereas something like 35mm or even wider is much more about the context of where the subject is. It's more about the environmental story of where the subject is and what's going on. And it's a great option if you are trying to tell more of a story with your portrait. Now, I think 85mm, 50mm, and 35mm are generally going to be your three portrait lens options that most people think of when they're thinking about portrait photography. There's a few others, like 135 is even more emphasized on kind of who the subject is, really focusing in on your subject. And you could even go to something like 24mm or even something like 16mm, or as wide as you want really, if you're trying to tell a very environmental story of your subject. So let's talk about a longer focal length for a moment. Most of these photos that I'm going to be showing on screen were taken with an 85mm lens. And that really does allow you a little bit more of an intimate connection with your subject. You're getting in close, you're getting in to know your subject, and the photo is all about the subject. The background is generally going to be more blurred out, you're going to have more separation. It makes your subject pop more in the photo. And the lens compression can really bring any background that is going to be visible much closer to the subject. It's much easier to control the background by using a longer focal length because you don't have to move very much to really change what's going to be in the background. 85mm in particular is one of my favorite focal lengths to use for portraits because I like getting in a little bit closer. I like that kind of intimate feel with the subject. And even better if you're shooting kind of candid photos, I guess, where it's not a posed portrait. I love this kind of focal length because it just really allows you, it almost feels like you're getting to know the subject. Now, if you're using a wider lens, 35mm, 24mm, or even wider than that, you are going to be encompassing a lot more of the surrounding area, a lot more of the kind of context, I guess, of where the subject is. So I always think of it a bit like this. Longer than 50mm is more about who the subject is, and wider than 50mm is more about where the subject is, telling a story and using the environment around the subject to really draw the viewer into what's happening. That also goes for zoom lenses, which I actually use quite a lot for portraiture as well. Now, they're not going to shoot as wide open in terms of the aperture as a prime lens, but they can be a really, really good option. And for me, there's two that I'll primarily go to: 24-70, which gives me a lot of versatility for the kind of shot I want to use, and certainly a lot of wider options as well. And then 70-200, which I love for portraiture because I can use a lot of lens compression, I can still blur out that background, and I've still got quite a lot of versatility for the kinds of shot that I want to go for. The benefit, of course, of zoom lenses is that it really does allow you way more flexibility because you are able to zoom. We've talked in the past about how a 70-200 really lets you control what's in frame. You know, if you personally move backwards and then zoom in, that background is now completely different to when you were standing a little bit closer. Even if the subject is the same size in the frame, the background is going to change in what's actually in frame, what's included because of the lens compression, which is a really, really useful tool when it comes to portrait photography. So without wanting to sound too obvious, it comes down to the end result you want to get. Is your shot more about who your subject is, getting to know your subject specifically? In which case it might be worth looking at 50mm or above. Or is your shot more of an environmental story, more about the context of where the subject is? Do you want to draw the viewer into some of that story of where that subject is and what's important and what's around them? In which case you might want to go for a little bit wider than 50mm, something like 35mm, 24mm, or even wider than that as well if you want to. And that is generally the main rule that I will use to work out what is the best focal length for this portrait. Now, I think it's important to mention that almost any lens can actually be a portrait lens. Here's a shot on a 150-600mm lens, which I'm actually really pleased with. The light was really nice and I was able to shoot actually through a forest. You can't really even tell there's that much forest stuff going on there, but I was really happy with the shot. And it's not a lens that you would typically think of when it comes to portrait photography, but almost any lens actually can be. It really just depends on the kind of shot that you want to go for. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because while there's not necessarily a best focal length, we certainly all have our favorites, right? I mentioned mine is 85mm, but I'd love to hear, what is your favorite focal length when it comes to shooting portrait photography? Are you like me? Do you like getting in a little bit closer, a little bit tighter with something like an 85mm? Or do you love those wide angle lenses or something maybe like a 35mm? Or did you start with a 50 and you just love the 50mm? I could understand that. I could understand that. Sometimes I think to myself, I do love a 50mm lens. I'd love to hear all of that down in the comments. Let me know, because it's really interesting to hear from you guys about all that kind of stuff. We'll have a full list of all the kit we use for all these different photos down in the description, so you can check that out. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe as well. New content all the time. I will see you next time. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.